March 15, 1961. Frank Kellerman stood in Fidel Castro's bedroom with a loaded Colt 45, 30 seconds from changing history. The CIA had sent their best man to eliminate the revolutionary. Castro lay sleeping, defenseless. Frank raised the gun. Then he did something that would haunt Washington for 60 years. Instead of pulling the trigger, Frank whispered 3 words that saved Castro's life. Bay of Pigs. Tomorrow, dawn. What happened next became the most classified operation in CIA history. Files were burned, agents disappeared, and Frank Kellerman was erased from official records, but never from Castro's memory. Now, 23 years later, someone is hunting down everyone who knew about that night. Frank's tobacco farm has become a killing ground, and the bearded farmer the CIA once mocked has just played his final card. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Winchester rifle cracked through the morning air, splintering the wooden post 6 inches from Frank Kellerman's head. He dove behind his rusted pickup truck as a second shot punched through the driver's side window, showering him with glass. 23 years of peaceful tobacco farming had done nothing to dull his instincts. Frank rolled left, staying low, his weathered hands already reaching for the Glock 19 he kept holstered beneath his flannel shirt. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same hands that had once spared Castro's life were about to take someone else's. Frank Kellerman! The voice carried across his 40-acre farm with practiced authority. Professional. Military trained. You can't run from what you did in Havana. Frank's blood turned to ice water. Only 7 people had known about that night in Castro's bedroom. According to his contacts, 5 were already dead. That left him, and apparently, one very motivated killer. Another shot rang out, this one from a different angle. Frank cursed under his breath. Multiple shooters. These weren't amateurs sent to silence a retired farmer. This was a coordinated execution squad. He belly-crawled toward the tobacco barn, using the truck's bulk as cover. The morning dew soaked through his jeans, and the familiar smell of Virginia soil filled his nostrils. Soil he'd worked with his hands, honest work that was supposed to wash away the blood of his CIA days. But the past never stayed buried, no matter how deep you planted it. The barn door hung open like a mouth, offering sanctuary 30 yards away. Frank studied the open ground between him and safety. No cover. He'd have to sprint and pray these contractors weren't as good as the ones the agency used to send. A muzzle flash erupted from behind his equipment shed. The bullet caught the truck's rear tire, and the vehicle settled with a mechanical sigh. Frank used the sound as cover and made his move. He sprinted toward the barn in a serpentine pattern, muscle memory from Langley training that his 55-year-old legs protested against. Another shot cracked overhead, then another. The barn door grew larger with each desperate stride. Frank dove through the entrance and rolled behind a stack of tobacco bales just as bullets shredded the wooden walls around him. Splinters rained down like deadly confetti. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown number. "Hello, Frank?" The voice was cultured, accented, familiar in a way that made Frank's stomach drop. "It has been too long, mi amigo." Frank's throat went dry. "That's impossible. You're dead." A low chuckle rumbled through the speaker. "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, as your Mark Twain once said. Did you really think I would forget your kindness that night in my bedroom?" The shooting outside had stopped. Frank peered through a gap in the tobacco bales, scanning for movement. "What do you want, Fidel?" "Justice, Frank. Justice for the man who betrayed his own country to save mine. You see, your government never quite forgave you for that moment of conscience, did they? Oh, they let you live, my condition for keeping your secret, but they made sure you paid in other ways." Frank's jaw clenched. His divorce, his daughter's estrangement, the agency's cold shoulder that lasted decades. All of it traced back to 3 whispered words in a dictator's bedroom. "The men outside," Frank said, "they're not CIA. No, they are mine, and they are very good at their jobs. But do not worry, I did not bring you this far to kill you quickly. We have so much to discuss about that night, about the Bay of Pigs, about how you helped me prepare for your country's invasion." Through the barn wall, Frank heard the distinctive sound of military boots on gravel, multiple sets. They were surrounding the building. You have something that belongs to me, Frank. Those photographs in the package I sent, they were just a sample. I want the rest of the files from that night, the ones you stole before disappearing into your peaceful farmer's life. Frank's hand moved instinctively to his shirt pocket, where he kept the key to a safety deposit box in Richmond. 23 years he'd held onto those insurance files, and now Castro wanted them back. And if I refuse? Then tomorrow's headlines will be very interesting. CIA trader discovered living as Virginia farmer. Your daughter Sarah will have fascinating reading material, assuming she survives the scandal. The boots were closer now. Frank counted at least 4 distinct patterns, professional spacing. These weren't just soldiers, they were elite operators. What makes you think I still care about any of this? Frank asked, though they both knew the answer. Because you are still the same man who chose conscience over country, the same man who couldn't pull the trigger when duty demanded it. That weakness saved my life, Frank. Now it will save your daughter's. The barn door exploded inward. Frank dropped the phone and raised his Glock, finger steady on the trigger. This time, 23 years later, he wouldn't hesitate to shoot. But the question that burned in his mind as armed figures poured through the doorway was the same one that had haunted him since 1961. When the moment came, would he choose country or conscience? The first muzzle flash lit up the barn like lightning, and Frank Kellerman dove into the darkness, still running from a decision that had shaped 6 decades of geopolitical history. Time moved like honey as Frank rolled behind the tobacco bales, the taste of cordite and 23 years of buried guilt sharp on his tongue. The barn erupted in gunfire, but these weren't kill shots. The bullets thudded into the wooden beams inches above his head, hurting him rather than hunting him. Castro's men were following orders to take him alive. Frank pressed his back against the rough burlap sacks, feeling the dried tobacco leaves crackle inside. He'd harvested these himself last autumn, working sunrise to sunset with hands that had once held classified files and foreign secrets. Honest work, clean work. The kind of labor that was supposed to wash away sins, though Frank had learned some stains went bone deep. "Mr. Kellerman," called a voice with a slight accent. "Cuban but educated in American schools. El Comandante wishes to speak with you again. Please make this simple for all of us." Frank closed his eyes and let muscle memory guide him. Count the voices, 4 distinct speakers. Track the boot patterns, standard tactical spacing, probably Spetsnaz trained given Castro's old Soviet connections. Calculate angles of fire. The training from Langley flowed back like blood returning to a sleeping limb. But it was the smell that transported him, tobacco, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of fear sweat. Suddenly he was back in Havana, 1961, standing in a moonlit bedroom while a young revolutionary slept peacefully, unaware that his enemy's assassin stood 3 feet away. Frank had raised his pistol, finger on the trigger, thinking of duty and country and the greater good. Then Castro had opened his eyes. "You are here to kill me," he'd said simply, no fear in his voice. "But you hesitate. Why?" Frank had stared into those dark eyes and seen not a monster, but a man who'd grown up poor, who'd watched his people suffer under dictators propped up by Frank's own government. A man who, right or wrong, believed he was fighting for something larger than himself. "Because you're not the enemy they told me you were," Frank had whispered, and lowered the gun. "Frank!" The voice in the barn snapped him back to the present. "We know about your daughter Sarah. Such a promising teacher. 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary in Richmond. She has your eyes, yes?" Ice flooded Frank's veins. Sarah, his beautiful, stubborn daughter who'd inherited his conscience and his ex-wife's fire. The daughter who hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. Not since she'd learned fragments of his CIA past and decided she couldn't reconcile the father she'd loved with the man who'd lived in shadows. He thought of her last voicemail, still saved on his phone. "Dad, I know you think you were protecting us by keeping secrets, but secrets are just another kind of lie. Call me when you're ready to tell me the truth." Frank had never called back. How could he explain that some truths were too dangerous to share, that loving someone sometimes meant letting them hate you for reasons they'd never understand? The gunfire stopped. In the sudden quiet, Frank heard his heart hammering against his ribs and the soft whistle of wind through bullet holes in the barn walls. Dust motes danced in the morning light streaming through the gaps, and for a moment the scene looked almost peaceful. "Your daughter is safe," came another voice, this one older, with the gravelly tone of a lifetime smoker. "For now. But El Comandante's patience has limits." Frank's Glock felt heavy in his hands. He'd cleaned this pistol every month for 23 years, maintaining skills he'd hoped never to use again. The weapon was loaded with hollow points, farm security, he'd told himself, though he'd always known this day might come. Through a gap in the tobacco bales he glimpsed movement near the barn's side door. A shadow, careful and professional. These men knew what they were doing. His phone buzzed again. Text message from an unknown number, but Frank recognized the writing style immediately. "Your government abandoned you, Frank. I did not. Consider my offer carefully. Your daughter's safety depends on your cooperation. FC." Below the message was a photograph that made Frank's blood freeze. Sarah walking out of her school, backpack slung over her shoulder, completely unaware of the camera watching her. The timestamp showed today's date, 2 hours ago. Frank closed his eyes and saw her at 7 years old, gap-toothed and proud, showing him her first loose tooth. At 15, fierce and righteous, arguing with him about American foreign policy without knowing her father had helped shape it. At 25, beautiful in her wedding dress, dancing with him while he wondered if he deserved such happiness. She was 31 now, divorced like her father, dedicated to her students with the same intensity Frank had once brought to classified missions. She was everything good in his life, everything worth protecting, everything that proved some part of him had remained human despite the things he'd done in service to his country. "Frank," called the voice again. "Time to decide. Conscience or country, just like before." Frank gripped his pistol tighter and prepared to make the same choice that had haunted him for 62 years. Frank exhaled slowly and stood up from behind the tobacco bales, his Glock lowered but ready. The barn fell silent except for the creak of old wood and his own thundering heartbeat. "I'm coming out," he called, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "But we do this civilized." 4 men emerged from the shadows like smoke given form. Professional operators, just as he'd assessed. The leader was a lean Cuban with silver threading his temples, wearing tactical gear that had seen real combat. His eyes held the particular hardness Frank recognized from his own mirror during the agency years. "Wise choice, Mr. Kellerman," the man said, gesturing for Frank to place his weapon on the ground. "I am Colonel Raul Vasquez. Perhaps you remember my father, Captain Miguel Vasquez? He was Castro's head of security in 1961. Frank's blood chilled as recognition dawned. Miguel Vasquez, the man who would have died alongside Castro if Frank had followed orders that night. The man whose son now stood before him, very much alive because of Frank's choice 6 decades ago. "Miguel's boy," Frank said, setting the Glock down carefully. "He used to show me pictures of you. You were, what, 12? 13? 15. Old enough to understand when my father explained how an American CIA operative saved his life by warning El Comandante of the assassination plot. Raul's expression was unreadable, old enough to remember the debt. One of the other operatives, a younger man with dead eyes, gestured impatiently. "Colonel, we have our orders." "Patience, Martinez," Raul said, never taking his eyes off Frank. "This moment has been 62 years in the making." Frank studied the younger operative's face and felt another shock of recognition. The bone structure, the cold intelligence behind the eyes. "Let me guess. Another legacy recruit?" "My nephew," Raul confirmed. "Carlos Martinez, grandson of Commander Eduardo Martinez. You saved his life too that night by preventing the invasion from proceeding as planned." The scope of Castro's long game began crystallizing in Frank's mind like frost on a window. Jesus Christ, how many of you are there? "Everyone whose family you saved by betraying your country," came a new voice from the barn entrance. Frank turned to see a woman approaching, mid-50s, carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I am Dr. Elena Herrera, daughter of Castro's personal physician, the man who would have been shot as a traitor if the assassination had succeeded and the regime collapsed." Frank's legs nearly gave out. The sheer scope of what he was seeing, the generational planning, the patient cultivation of assets, made the CIA's longest operations look like amateur hour. "You're all connected," he whispered. "Every family that benefited from that night. Castro's been building this network for 60 years. El Comandante understood something your agency never grasped," Elena said, pulling out a satellite phone. "Revolution isn't just about ideology. It's about family, about debt, about honor passed from father to son, mother to daughter." She dialed a number and handed Frank the phone. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. Older now, weakened by age and illness, but unmistakably the same voice that had thanked him in whispered Spanish 6 decades ago. "Frank, my old friend," Castro said, his English still heavily accented but precise. "You are wondering why I waited so long to call in this debt, yes?" Frank's throat felt like sandpaper. "You're supposed to be dead." A wheezing laugh. "I am dying, it is true. Cancer, the doctors say. But I am not dead yet, and I needed to live long enough to complete our business." "What business?" "I don't owe you anything." "But you do, Frank. You owe me the truth." Castro's voice grew stronger, more focused. "For 60 years, I have protected your secret. When your CIA colleagues died in those convenient accidents, car crashes, heart attacks, suicides, I made sure the investigations found nothing pointing to you." Frank's knees buckled. He caught himself against a wooden beam, his mind reeling. "You've been killing them, all these years." "Not killing, Frank. Protecting. Your government would have executed you for treason if they had learned the full truth about that night. So I eliminated those who might talk, one by one, year by year. A long-term investment in keeping my greatest asset alive." "Asset?" The word came out strangled. "Did you think your warning was the end of our relationship? Oh, Frank, you have been working for me much longer than you realize. Every piece of intelligence you gathered after 1961, every operation you ran, every report you filed, all of it eventually found its way to me through channels you never suspected." The barn started spinning around Frank. 23 years of retirement, thinking he'd escaped his past, thinking his conscience had cost him everything but at least left him clean. Now Castro was telling him that his entire CIA career had been compromised from that first moment of moral choice. "You played the long game," Frank said, his voice barely audible. "The longest game, mi amigo. And now it is time for the final move. You are going to help me complete something I began in 1961. Something that will reshape the balance of power between our nations forever." Frank closed his eyes, knowing with absolute certainty that his quiet life as a tobacco farmer was over. Whatever Castro wanted, it would cost Frank everything he had left, including his daughter's safety and his own soul. The inciting incident had finally arrived, 62 years late, but right on schedule. Frank's hand trembled as he gripped the satellite phone, Castro's words echoing in his skull like shrapnel. The barn felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as the magnitude of his situation crystallized. 62 years of manipulation, his entire adult life orchestrated by a dying revolutionary. "No," Frank said into the phone, his voice barely a whisper. "Whatever you want, the answer is no." The silence stretched long enough that Frank wondered if Castro had died on the other end. Then came that familiar chuckle, weaker now but still carrying the same confidence that had unnerved American presidents for decades. "You say no, but your heart says yes, Frank. It always has. That is why you warned me that night instead of pulling the trigger." Frank looked around the barn at the faces watching him, children and grandchildren of men he'd inadvertently saved. Their expressions held no malice, just patient certainty, as if they were waiting for him to accept an inevitable truth. "This is insane," Frank said, louder now. "I'm not your asset. I never was. I made one choice, one moment of conscience, and then I was done." "Were you?" Dr. Herrera stepped closer, her voice gentle but implacable. "Tell me, Frank, about the operation in Guatemala in 1963, the one where you reported that the communist cell had fled the country." Frank's blood went cold. He remembered Guatemala, the humid jungle safe house, the family huddled inside. A father, mother, 2 young children, Marxist sympathizers according to his intelligence, but when he'd seen them up close, they just looked scared. Poor farmers who'd attended the wrong political meeting, They had disappeared, Frank said, but the words felt hollow. They had, Elena agreed, because you warned them through intermediaries, just like you warned El Comandante, just like you warned the Union leaders in Chile in 1965. The pattern was there, Frank, for those who knew how to look. Each example hit him like a physical blow. Frank slumped against the barn wall, memories flooding back. A dozen operations where he'd found reasons to delay, to give targets time to escape, to file reports that were technically accurate but practically useless. He'd told himself these were isolated incidents, moral corrections to an amoral profession. "You made me into this," he whispered into the phone. "I made nothing," Castro replied. "I simply recognized what you already were, a man who chose humanity over ideology. Your CIA superiors never understood this gift. They saw only an agent who produced mixed results. But I saw an opportunity." Colonel Vasquez pulled out a tablet and showed Frank the screen surveillance photos spanning decades. Frank at a cafe in Vienna in 1967, passing documents to a contact. Frank in a Mexico City hotel in 1972, meeting with a woman who worked for Cuban intelligence. Frank in dozens of locations, conducting what he'd believed were legitimate CIA operations. "Every contact was ours," Vasquez said quietly. "Every piece of intelligence you gathered, every source you developed, every network you infiltrated, all of it fed back to Havana. You were never hunting Castro's agents, Frank. You were one of them." Frank's legs gave out completely. He slid down the barn wall until he was sitting in the dirt and hay, the weight of 60 years crushing down on him. His daughter's face flashed in his mind. Sarah, at graduation, proud and shining, introducing him to her friends as "my dad," the government consultant. If she knew the truth— "Sarah doesn't need to know," Castro said, as if reading his thoughts. "No one needs to know if you help me complete this final operation." "What operation?" Frank asked, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. "Your president believes he has won, Frank. The Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba appears isolated, and capitalism reigns supreme. But what if I told you that for 30 years we have been building something new, something that will make the Cold War look like a children's game?" Elena touched a control on her tablet. A map appeared showing the United States with dozens of red dots scattered across major cities. Frank recognized the pattern immediately: strategic infrastructure points, power grids, communication hubs, military installations, sleeper networks. Frank breathed. Families, Frank. Generations of families whose children grew up American, attended American schools, joined American institutions. All waiting for activation, all placed using intelligence that you helped us gather. The barn started spinning again. Frank thought of every contact he'd made, every asset he'd developed, every piece of information he'd collected during his CIA career. Castro had turned it all into a map for infiltrating American society at its deepest levels. "You're talking about destroying the country from within." "I am talking about evolution," Castro replied. "Your daughter teaches children, yes? What if some of those children's parents were part of our network? What if some of her fellow teachers were? The revolution doesn't need armies anymore, Frank. It needs patience. And it needs one last gift from the man who made it all possible." Frank closed his eyes, knowing that whatever Castro asked of him next would force him to choose once again between conscience and country. Except this time, he could no longer tell which side represented which. Frank opened his eyes to find Elena crouched beside him, her expression almost maternal. In her hands was a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. "Before you answer," she said softly, "you should understand the full scope of what you've already given us." She opened the folder, and Frank's past spilled out across the barn floor like blood from a wound. Photos of his ex-wife Margaret leaving a therapist's office, dated 3 months after their divorce. Medical records from Sarah's childhood, including a psychological evaluation Frank had never known existed. Bank statements showing payments to a private investigator who'd been watching his family for years. "We know everything, Frank," Elena continued. "We know Margaret left you because the nightmares were getting worse, because you'd wake up screaming in Spanish about choices you couldn't unmake. We know Sarah applied to the Peace Corps twice, but was rejected both times due to security concerns related to her father's classified service record. Frank's hands shook as he picked up one of the photographs. Sarah, at 22, bright-eyed and idealistic, walking out of the Peace Corps recruitment office with tears streaming down her face. He remembered that day. She'd called him crying, asking why her background check had been flagged, why her dream of helping people overseas had been crushed by bureaucratic red tape. He'd told her it was just bad luck, another lie to add to the mountain he'd built between them. "Your conscience saved my father that night," Colonel Vasquez said, kneeling on Frank's other side. "But it destroyed your family. Your wife couldn't live with a man who flinched every time someone mentioned Cuba on the news. Your daughter couldn't understand why her hero father had become a broken hermit who grew tobacco and drank himself to sleep." "Stop," Frank whispered, but they continued pulling documents from the folder. A copy of Margaret's diary entry from 1995. "Frank came home from another consultation yesterday, but he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He keeps talking in his sleep about warning someone, about saving a life he was supposed to take. I can't do this anymore. I can't live with a man who's haunting himself." Sarah's college application essay. "My father taught me that doing the right thing sometimes means breaking the rules. He won't tell me why he left the government, but I know it was because he chose his conscience over his career. I want to serve people the way he did, before whatever happened that broke his heart." Frank's vision blurred. Every document was a small knife, cutting open wounds he'd spent decades trying to heal. His daughter had idolized the very thing that made him a traitor. His wife had left him because she sensed the guilt he carried, even though she'd never known its true weight. "The beautiful irony," Castro's voice crackled through the phone, "is that your family paid the price for my survival while believing you were a hero. Sarah chose education because she wanted to help people like her father supposedly did. Margaret divorced you because she couldn't live with the consequences of a choice she never understood." Elena pulled out the final document, a recent photograph of Sarah grading papers at her kitchen table, a framed picture of her and Frank visible in the background. It had been taken from outside her apartment window, probably yesterday. "She still loves you, Frank," Elena said. "Despite everything, despite the silence and the distance and the lies, she still has your picture on her table. She's still waiting for you to trust her with the truth." Frank's chest felt like it was caving in. 3 years of silence. 3 years of telling himself that staying away was protecting her, that some secrets were too dangerous to share. Now he understood that his isolation hadn't been protection. It had been cowardice. Fear that if she knew what he really was, she'd look at him the way he looked at himself in the mirror every morning. "What do you want?" Frank asked into the phone, his voice hoarse with decades of suppressed grief. "Your expertise," Castro replied. "There is one final target in our network, one last connection that needs to be made. A man in your intelligence community who has been hunting me for 40 years, who suspects the truth about that night in 1961 and has been slowly building a case against you." Frank's blood turned to ice water. "Who?" "Deputy Director James Morrison. Your old friend, the man who recommended you for the Castro mission because he trusted your patriotism above all others." The phone almost slipped from Frank's numb fingers. Jim Morrison, his mentor, his friend, the man who'd stood as best man at his wedding, the man who'd called him twice in the past month, wanting to meet for coffee, to catch up on old times. Frank had ignored the calls, assuming Jim was just being nostalgic. Now he realized Morrison had been investigating him, had maybe been investigating him for years. "He's close to the truth," Castro continued. "Too close. And when he presents his evidence to the president, your daughter won't just lose her father to a prison cell. She'll lose her faith in everything she believes about right and wrong. She'll learn that the man who taught her about conscience was actually a traitor who sold his country's secrets for 60 years. Frank looked up at the faces surrounding him. 3 generations of families whose lives he'd inadvertently saved, all waiting patiently for him to save himself. The choice was the same as it had always been: conscience or country, family or duty, love or loyalty. But this time, Frank could no longer tell which side was which. Frank stared at the phone in his trembling hands, Morrison's name echoing in his mind like a death knell. His mentor, his friend, the man who had believed in Frank's integrity so completely that he'd recommended him for the most sensitive mission of his career. You want me to kill Jim Morrison, Frank said, the words tasting like ash. I want you to save your daughter's future, Castro replied smoothly. Morrison's investigation will destroy everything. Your reputation, Sarah's career, her faith in the father she still loves despite your cowardice. Frank's head snapped up. My cowardice? Hiding from her for 3 years. Making her believe she did something wrong, that she wasn't worth your time or truth. Do you know what she tells her students when they ask about her family, Frank? Elena held up another document, a transcript from Sarah's classroom, recorded without her knowledge. Frank's hands shook as he read his daughter's words. My dad was a good man who did important work for the government. Something happened that hurt him deeply, and now he needs space to heal. Sometimes the people we love most need us to love them from a distance. The words hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had been protecting his reputation while he'd been drowning in guilt, building narratives to explain his absence to children who asked innocent questions about why their teacher looked sad sometimes. She's been lying for you, Colonel Vasquez observed, creating stories to preserve the image of a father who abandoned her rather than trust her with the truth. Frank's vision blurred. I was protecting her. No, Castro's voice cut through the phone like a blade. You were protecting yourself, just like you've been doing for 60 years. The accusation hung in the air, and Frank felt something shift inside him, a wall he'd built cracking under pressure. All those years of telling himself he'd made noble sacrifices, that his isolation was heroic self-denial. But Castro was right. He'd been hiding. The night you warned me, Castro continued, you told yourself it was about conscience. But it wasn't, was it, Frank? It was about fear. Fear of looking into a man's eyes and pulling the trigger. Fear of becoming a killer. That's not. You've spent 60 years convincing yourself you were moral, that you chose humanity over duty. But you didn't save me because you were good, Frank. You saved me because you were weak. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Frank's carefully constructed self-image, the tortured hero who'd sacrificed everything for his principles, began crumbling. He saw himself clearly for the first time in decades, a frightened young agent who'd choked when the moment came, who'd spent a lifetime building mythology around his failure to complete a mission. Every choice after that, Castro pressed on. Every time you warned a target, every piece of intelligence you compromised, all of it was you trying to prove you weren't a coward. But you were never serving a higher cause. You were just a broken man making broken choices. Frank looked around the barn at the faces watching him. 3 generations of families who owed their existence to what he'd always believed was his moment of moral clarity. Now he saw them differently, not as beneficiaries of his conscience, but as monuments to his weakness. Their very presence was Castro's final psychological manipulation, forcing Frank to confront the lie he'd been telling himself for 6 decades. You orchestrated all of this, Frank whispered, not just the intelligence network. This, right now, making you see what you really are, Castro finished. A man who has been running from the truth since 1961. A man who let his family pay the price for his cowardice while he hid behind noble justifications. Frank's phone rang suddenly, the harsh sound cutting through the barn's heavy silence. He looked at the screen. Morrison's number. His old friend calling again, probably wondering why Frank had been avoiding him. Probably ready to share what he'd discovered about that night in Havana. Answer it, Elena said softly. Face him. For once in your life, stop running. Frank stared at the phone, Morrison's name flashing on the screen. Behind him, Castro's breathing wheezed through the satellite phone. Around him, the families waited. And somewhere in Richmond, his daughter was probably grading papers, still keeping his picture on her table, still believing in a father who had never had the courage to tell her who he really was. The phone continued ringing. In 10 seconds, it would go to voicemail, and Morrison would leave another message Frank would ignore. Another choice deferred, another moment of cowardice disguised as protection. Frank looked up at Elena. What happens to Sarah if I answer? That depends, she replied, on whether you're finally ready to stop lying to yourself about why you're really here. The phone rang one more time, and Frank made his choice. Frank's thumb hovered over the answer button as the phone completed its final ring. The screen went dark, Morrison's name disappearing into electronic silence. But this time, instead of relief, Frank felt something break inside him. A dam he'd spent 60 years building to hold back the truth. "You're right," he whispered into the satellite phone, his voice barely audible. "All of it. I've been running since the night I was supposed to kill you." The admission hung in the barn's dusty air like a confession at last rites. Elena's expression didn't change, but Frank caught something that might have been pity flickering in her eyes. "Then you understand," Castro's voice crackled through the connection, "that Morrison's investigation isn't really about national security. It's about finally forcing you to face what you've always been." Frank's phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Without hesitation this time, he played it on speaker. Morrison's familiar voice filled the barn, gravelly with age but sharp with purpose. "Frank, it's Jim. Look, I know you've been avoiding my calls, and I think I know why. I'm coming to see you tomorrow morning. There are things we need to discuss about Cuba, about that night in '61. Things I should have asked you decades ago." A pause, heavy with meaning. "I'm not coming as deputy director, Frank. I'm coming as your friend. But either way, we're going to have this conversation." The message ended, leaving only the sound of Frank's labored breathing and the distant rustle of tobacco leaves in the wind outside. 36 hours, Colonel Vasquez said, consulting his watch. "That's how long you have before he arrives with questions you can't deflect and evidence you can't deny." Frank looked down at the scattered photographs of his family, his failures spread across the barn floor like autopsy results. What evidence? Elena opened another folder Frank hadn't noticed before. This one contained surveillance photos, but not of his past operations. These were recent. Morrison entering a storage facility in Langley, Morrison meeting with retired agents in coffee shops, Morrison sitting in his office late at night, surrounded by files marked with Frank's operational code names. "He's been building this case for 5 years, Elena explained. "Ever since the Castro assassination files were partially declassified, and he started noticing discrepancies in the official reports. Your psychological evaluation from after the mission recommended you for continued fieldwork, but Morrison never understood why you seemed almost relieved when the operation failed." Frank remembered that evaluation, remembered lying to the CIA psychologist about his feelings, about the nightmares that weren't about failing to kill Castro but about almost becoming a killer. Morrison had been in the room when the results came back, had clapped Frank on the shoulder, and said he knew Frank would bounce back from the disappointment. But Morrison was too smart, too experienced to let discrepancies lie dormant forever. "He found the Mexico City photographs last month," Colonel Vasquez continued. "You meeting with Maria Santos in 1972. The CIA believed she was an asset you were developing, but Morrison ran her picture through facial recognition, software that didn't exist 30 years ago." Frank's stomach lurched. Maria Santos, the woman he'd believed was a disaffected Cuban embassy employee willing to share intelligence. In reality, she'd been feeding him carefully crafted disinformation, while he unknowingly provided her with genuine American intelligence. Another manipulation he'd been too naive or too willing to see. "Morrison knows Maria was DGI, Elena said, using the acronym for Cuban intelligence. He knows you met with her 17 times over 3 years. He knows the intelligence you claimed to receive from her was sophisticated enough that it had to come from someone with high-level access to Cuban government operations." The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Morrison wasn't just investigating a potential security breach from decades past. He was unraveling the entire mythology Frank had built around his career, discovering that America's most trusted intelligence officer had been an unwitting double agent for 40 years. When he presents this to the president, Castro's voice resumed through the phone. "It won't just destroy you, Frank. It will call into question every operation you touched, every agent you recruited, every piece of intelligence you gathered. The damage assessment alone will take years." Frank stood slowly, his knees protesting after sitting in the dirt. Around him, the families watched with patient eyes, 3 generations of people whose lives hung in the balance of choices made before some of them were born. "And Sarah?" Frank asked, though he dreaded the answer. "She'll learn that her father wasn't just a broken hero," Elena said softly. "She'll learn he was a traitor whose weakness compromised American national security for half a century. Every student she teaches, every colleague who respects her, every relationship she's built, all of it will be tainted by your legacy. Frank walked to the barn's open door, looking out at the tobacco fields he'd tended for 23 years. His refuge, his penance, his prison. Tomorrow morning, Morrison would drive up that dirt road with questions that would end everything Frank had spent decades trying to protect. The time for running was over. The only question now was whether he'd face the truth as the man he'd pretended to be, or the coward he'd always known himself to be. Behind him, Castro waited for an answer that would determine not just Frank's fate, but the final act of a game that had been playing out since 1961. Frank turned back from the barn door, his decision crystallizing with the weight of 60 years of deception. The satellite phone felt heavy in his hands as he raised it one final time. "No," he said simply. Castro's breathing wheezed through the connection, but he said nothing. Elena's eyebrows raised slightly, the first crack in her professional composure Frank had seen all evening. "You want me to kill Jim Morrison to protect a lie I'm tired of living," Frank continued, his voice gaining strength. "But the truth is, Fidel, your greatest manipulation wasn't turning me into your asset. It was convincing me I had to keep living as one." "Frank," Castro began, but Frank cut him off. "I was a coward in 1961. You're right about that. But every choice I made afterward, warning targets, protecting sources, questioning orders, those weren't just attempts to justify my weakness. They were me trying to become the man my daughter believed I was." Frank looked at the families surrounding him, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and fear. "You brought them here to show me the consequences of my choices, but you miscalculated. Looking at them doesn't make me feel guilty. It makes me proud." Colonel Vasquez reached for the weapon at his side, but Frank was already moving. 62 years old, but 23 years of farm work had kept him stronger than they'd anticipated. He swept Elena's legs, sending her sprawling into the folders of photographs, then drove his shoulder into Vasquez's midsection before the man could draw his gun. The satellite phone clattered to the ground, Castro's voice shouting orders in Spanish as Frank rolled behind a stack of tobacco crates. Vasquez fired twice, the shots echoing through the barn like thunder. The families scattered, parents shielding children, but no one panicked. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd lived their entire lives understanding that violence could arrive without warning. Frank's cell phone was still in his hand. Without hesitation, he speed-dialed Morrison's number. It rang once before his old friend's voice answered. "Frank? Jesus, it's almost midnight. Are you—" "Jim, listen carefully," Frank said, keeping low as Vasquez circled the barn. "I'm at my farm. There are Cuban intelligence operatives here, and I need immediate federal backup." Silence on the line. Then, "Frank, what the hell is going on? The conversation you wanted to have about 1961? You were right to be suspicious. But it's more complicated than you think, and I don't have time to explain. Just get FBI tactical units to my location now." Elena had recovered from her fall and was speaking rapidly into a radio. Through the barn's gaps, Frank could see vehicles starting up in the distance, Castro's people preparing to evacuate before law enforcement arrived. "Frank," Morrison's voice was tight with concern and growing understanding, "are you telling me you've been compromised?" "For 60 years, Frank replied, then had to duck as Vasquez fired again. "But not in the way you think." The satellite phone was still active on the ground, Castro's voice now barely a whisper. "You cannot win this, Frank. Even if you escape tonight, the truth will destroy your daughter. I will make certain of it." Frank Army crawled toward the phone, glass from a shattered lantern cutting into his palms. When he reached it, he spoke directly into the receiver. "You taught me something tonight, Fidel. You showed me that the worst prisons are the ones we build in our own minds. I've been your prisoner since 1961, not because you had leverage over me, but because I was too afraid to face what I'd done." He could hear sirens in the distance. Morrison must have called from his car, already en route. Frank had maybe 5 minutes before the property was swarming with federal agents. "Sarah deserves the truth," Frank continued. "All of it. The cowardice, the manipulation, the consequences. But she also deserves to know that when the moment came to choose between protecting a lie and protecting innocent lives, her father finally chose correctly." Castro's laughter was bitter. full of decades of frustrated victory. You think confession will absolve you? You think honesty will erase treason? No, Frank said, standing up as Vasquez and Elena retreated toward the barn's rear exit. But it might help my daughter understand that sometimes the most important battles aren't against enemies, they, against the parts of ourselves we're afraid to face. Frank smashed the satellite phone against the concrete floor, severing the connection that had bound him to Castro for 6 decades. Outside, the sirens grew louder, and Frank could see headlights turning up his drive. Morrison, coming to arrest him or save him, maybe both. For the first time since 1961, Frank Kellerman felt free. The truth would destroy everything he'd built, but it would also, finally, let him die as the man he'd always wanted to be, the man his daughter had always believed him to be. The FBI tactical units arrived like a thunderstorm breaking over the Virginia countryside. Frank watched from the barn doorway as black SUVs surrounded his property, their headlights turning the tobacco fields into a stark tableau of shadows and revelation. Morrison emerged from the lead vehicle, his familiar silhouette moving with the careful urgency of a man who'd spent 40 years cleaning up messes like this. But this wasn't just another mess. This was the unraveling of everything. By dawn, the families were gone, evacuated to safe houses where their stories would be carefully documented and their futures quietly secured. Vasquez and Elena had vanished into the night like smoke, but Frank knew it didn't matter. The real damage was already done. The truth was finally free. Frank sat on his front porch as the sun rose over his tobacco fields, watching forensics teams catalog evidence from the barn. Morrison approached slowly, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, the same ritual they'd shared countless times over 4 decades of friendship. "You look like hell," Morrison said, settling into the wooden chair beside him. "Feel worse than that." Frank accepted the coffee gratefully. "How much do you know?" "Enough to understand why you've been avoiding my calls." Morrison stared out at the fields, his weathered face betraying nothing. "The question is, how much of it was conscious collaboration and how much was manipulation?" Frank had been dreading this conversation for 23 years, but now that it was finally here, he felt only relief. "At first, pure manipulation. I thought I was developing assets when I was being developed. Thought I was serving American interests when I was serving Cuban ones." He paused, sipping the bitter coffee. "But somewhere along the way, I started making conscious choices. Started believing that maybe protecting innocent lives mattered more than protecting national interests." "That's treason, Frank." "I know." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Saw the news. "Coming home. Don't talk to anyone until I get there." The news. Frank realized with a sick feeling that he hadn't considered the media circus this would become. Former CIA operative exposed as decades-long double agent, national security implications stretching back 50 years. His daughter's life about to become a fishbowl of scrutiny and judgment. "She doesn't deserve this," Frank said quietly. Morrison followed his gaze to the phone. "No. But she deserves the truth. That's what you said last night anyway. You heard that?" "I heard a lot of things." Morrison's expression softened slightly, including a man finally taking responsibility for choices he made when he was young and scared and in way over his head. A black sedan turned up the drive, not government issue, but Frank recognized it immediately. Sarah's Honda, the same car she'd driven since graduate school because she believed in making things last. His chest tightened as he watched her park behind the FBI vehicles, her small frame emerging with the determined stride he remembered from her childhood. She climbed the porch steps without acknowledging Morrison, her eyes fixed solely on her father. At 38, she looked exactly like her mother had at the same age, the same dark hair, the same fierce intelligence burning behind gentle eyes. "Dad," she said simply. Frank stood, uncertain whether she would embrace him or strike him. Instead, she sat down in his vacated chair and looked out at the tobacco fields she'd grown up visiting every summer. "I always wondered why you seemed so sad," she said after a long moment. "Even when you smiled, even when you laughed at my terrible jokes, there was this weight you carried. I used to think it was because Mom left. Sarah..." "Let me finish." Her voice was steady, controlled. When the FBI called me this morning, when they explained what was happening, my first thought wasn't about national security or treason or any of that. It was about how relieved you must feel. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. After 60 years of carrying secrets, his daughter's first instinct had been to worry about his emotional well-being. "I failed you," he said hoarsely. "I failed everyone." Sarah finally looked at him, and Frank saw tears in her eyes. Not of anger or betrayal, but of something that looked remarkably like understanding. "You were 25 years old when this started, Dad. Barely older than my students. You made a choice in an impossible situation, and then you spent the rest of your life trying to atone for it." She reached out and took his weathered hand in hers. "Maybe it was the wrong choice. Maybe it caused damage I'll never fully understand. But you've been punishing yourself for 60 years. Isn't that enough?" Frank looked at his daughter, this remarkable woman who'd somehow grown up believing in goodness despite having a father who'd embodied moral compromise. Around them, the investigation continued. But in that moment, sitting on the porch where they'd shared so many summer evenings, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since 1961. Forgiveness. Not from his country, not from history, but from the person who mattered most. The tobacco fields stretched endlessly under the Virginia sun, just as they had yesterday morning when Frank's greatest fear was facing the truth. Now the truth was free, and so was he.